So the first pillar is being kind to your mind. This is not just talking about mental health and maintaining a balanced mental state, but also learning to cultivate compassion and inner kindness. So there are many different ways that we can start to be kind to our minds. The biggest thing that worked for me was to actually look at the voice inside my head and how I related to myself, how I spoke to myself, the words I used. I've shared this before on my social media, that there was one day, I think it was about 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, I was walking down the street here in Ulm, and I had done something, I can't even remember what the thing was, but it was relatively small. I know that it wasn't a massive life-changing mistake. But I'd made this mistake, and I remember walking down the street for probably about a minute, maybe a minute and a half, berating myself inside my mind. And inside my head, I was talking to myself and saying things like, "You are such a fucking idiot," excuse my language. "How could you have done that? What are you going to do now? How could you be so stupid? Why do you never learn? How idiotic can you be?" I know, it's intense. It was so intense that at some point I stopped, and it was like I became aware of what I was saying in my mind. And then I literally stopped in the middle of the street and I said, "Whoa, stop. I can't speak to myself like this." Because the truth is that if anybody else, doesn't matter who, my boyfriend, my boss, my friends, my mom, my dad, a stranger on the street, if anybody else in this entire planet would have spoken to me like that, I probably would have broken down and cried, first of all. But I wouldn't have stood for it. I would never allow anybody to speak to me in such an abusive way. And yet I was speaking to myself like that. And this was a really big light bulb moment where I realized that this was not okay. And since then, I have trained my mind and am still training my mind to become aware of those times when I slip into negative criticism, negative language, to stop and say something nice instead. To be a little bit more subjective. And this is something that has a huge impact, because when you can start to learn to treat yourself with kindness, with more compassion, with more understanding, then you take a lot of pressure off yourself and you realize that actually it's not that bad. You don't need to swear at yourself, to abuse yourself, to make yourself feel down, small. So that's one example of how you can start to cultivate some inner kindness and inner compassion. The second way, or a second way that you can also start to be kind to your mind, is to maybe become aware of your energetic boundaries. So if you're someone who overcommits, who always says yes, maybe looking at how you really feel when someone asks if you want to go for dinner, if you want to spend time, if you want to do something, if you're starting to feel maybe tired, maybe a little bit run down. Sometimes the body actually shows us in physical ways when we've reached our energetic limits by giving us headaches, by ringing in the ears, by feeling a little bit internally shaky. So learning to recognize when you've reached your boundaries, when you need to take a step back and rest, is also a good way to balance your nervous system, to not constantly push it. Another way is to maybe look at removing or reducing toxicity in your life. Now, I don't mean just toxicity in terms of what you eat, what you drink, but again, how do you feel around certain people? How do you feel in certain places? Most of us, unfortunately, have people in our lives who drain a lot of energy, who maybe attract a lot of drama in their lives, and who turn to us and expect us to be there to help them out of jams, or at least to listen when there's some new massive drama that's happening. And this can have a massive effect on us too, especially if you're someone who identifies as being a little bit more of an empath. Also things like, what are you consuming media-wise? If scrolling through your Instagram feed or Facebook feed makes you feel less inside because you feel like you can't relate to those people, then maybe it's time to hit unfollow. If you're someone who loves the thrill of watching horror films but then finds that they can't sleep at night, or that they feel strange being out in the nature alone or being in dark rooms, then maybe that's the way to reduce toxicity too. Now, obviously, some of us tackle mental health issues a lot more than others, and it's not something that can be simply whitewashed over. Balancing mental health is something that is not always easy, but it is something that we can all do. We can all look at ways to help us keep our minds healthy and balanced. So learning to show your mind, your inner state, some kindness is, I think, one of the biggest ways that you can start to cultivate compassion, love. And remember that one of those definitions of love was compassion, respect.